Killers of the Flower Moon, directed by Martin Scorsese, is a deeply layered, thought-provoking film that immerses the audience into one of the darkest and most tragic chapters of American history. Based on the best-selling non-fiction book by David Grann, the film explores the Osage murders in Oklahoma during the 1920s. These brutal killings, committed by a network of opportunistic conspirators, were part of a systematic plot to steal the wealth of the Osage people, who had become among the richest individuals in the world due to the discovery of oil beneath their land. The film meticulously chronicles the exploitation, corruption, and violence that targeted the Osage Nation, presenting a chilling story of greed, racism, and betrayal. Scorsese, known for his masterful storytelling and rich character development, delivers a film that is not only a historical crime drama, but also a scathing critique of the systemic injustice faced by Native Americans. What sets Killers of the Flower Moon apart from other historical dramas is Scorsese's ability to balance the grim and harrowing details of the murders with a deeply emotional and personal narrative. At the heart of the film are the Osage people who, despite their newfound wealth, become victims of unimaginable cruelty and exploitation. The story centers on their suffering, and more specifically, on one Osage family's struggle as they are targeted by outsiders who want to seize their wealth at any cost. The emotional weight of the story is carried by the performances of the cast, particularly Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, and Lily Gladstone, whose portrayals bring humanity and depth to the characters caught in this dark, intricate web of greed and violence. The film's pacing is deliberate, allowing the audience to fully immerse themselves in the slowly unfolding horrors faced by the Osage people. This methodical build-up heightens the sense of impending doom and makes the eventual revelation of the extent of the conspiracy all the more devastating. Scorsese, along with his talented screenwriters, ensures that every moment of violence is counterbalanced by emotional depth, making the audience feel not just the weight of the historical events, but also the personal stakes for the characters involved. The film opens with a haunting portrayal of the Osage people's prosperity. Set against the backdrop of 1920s Oklahoma, the Osage Nation had gained incredible wealth from the discovery of oil beneath their land. Their wealth, however, soon attracted the attention of those who saw the Osage as nothing more than a source of easy profit. As the Osage were granted rights to the oil, white settlers and businessmen began to devise ways to claim that wealth for themselves. What followed were a series of cold-blooded murders that targeted Osage men and women who had control of the oil rights, and these crimes, while shocking, were largely overlooked or ignored by law enforcement at the time. Scorsese's decision to depict this historical event with such raw and unflinching detail serves as a powerful commentary on the racial and systemic injustices that have plagued Native Americans for centuries. A key aspect of the film is how it highlights the Osage murders as an example of broader exploitation and corruption in American society. While the focus of the plot is on the Osage people, Killers of the Flower Moon serves as a larger critique of the ways in which the American legal and economic systems were skewed to benefit white settlers at the expense of Native American communities. The film makes it clear that the Osage murders were not isolated incidents but part of a larger systemic effort to dispossess Native peoples of their land and wealth. Through Scorsese's meticulous direction and the film's rich historical context, the audience is made to confront the uncomfortable reality that such injustices were not only tolerated but actively enabled by local authorities and the government. The film also delves into the personal stakes of those involved in the Osage murders. The central character of Ernest Burkhart, portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio, is a complicated figure whose involvement in the conspiracy remains ambiguous for much of the film. Ernest is caught between his loyalty to his uncle, William Hale, Robert De Niro, who is the mastermind behind the murders, and his love for his Osage wife, Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone. This internal conflict adds an emotional layer to the story, as Ernest struggles with his moral compass and his role in the destruction of his wife's family. DiCaprio's performance is one of the highlights of the film, as he brings to life a man torn between his affection for Molly and the guilt he feels over his involvement in her people's suffering. The emotional weight of Ernest's journey is mirrored by Molly's own tragic realization. Molly, played by Lily Gladstone, is the emotional heart of the film. She represents the Osage people's suffering and resilience in the face of unthinkable loss. Gladstone's portrayal of Molly is filled with quiet strength and heartbreak, capturing the pain of a woman who has lost her family to betrayal. As she watches the murders unfold, her grief is palpable, and her struggle to understand why those she trusted would do such a thing is deeply moving. Molly's relationship with Ernest, which begins with love and affection, becomes strained as the truth about the murders slowly emerges. Gladstone's performance is understated yet powerful, as she shows the quiet determination of a woman who, despite her immense loss, refuses to let her spirit be broken. One of the key themes in Killers of the Flower Moon is the complex relationship between the white settlers and the Native Americans, and the film addresses this with unflinching honesty. The Osage were not just victims of greed. They were also seen as an inconvenience by many in the surrounding white communities who sought to profit from their wealth. The film explores how systemic racism and institutionalized exploitation were not only accepted but perpetuated by those in power. It's a chilling reminder of the lengths to which people will go when their greed and prejudice are unchecked. In addition to the performances and historical context, the cinematography of Killers of the Flower Moon is another standout feature. Scorsese, working with his longtime collaborator Rodrigo Prieto, creates a visually stunning film that captures both the beauty and the desolation of the American landscape. The wide, sweeping shots of the Oklahoma plains are contrasted with the intimacy of the murder scenes, adding a stark visual element to the film's exploration of vast institutional injustice. The cinematography also serves to reinforce the isolation felt by the Osage people as they face the betrayal and violence of those who seek to control their wealth. The score of the film, composed by Robbie Robertson, complements the visuals and emotional tone of the movie. The haunting music adds to the film's somber atmosphere, highlighting the tension and grief that permeate the story. The score is subtle yet powerful, providing an emotional backdrop that enhances the film's exploration of loss, betrayal, and the struggle for justice. The setting of Killers of the Flower Moon plays an integral role in telling the story, providing not only a vivid backdrop but also serving as a reflection of the larger themes of exploitation, power, and systemic injustice that permeate the film. The story takes place in Osage County, Oklahoma, during the 1920s, when the Osage Nation had become extraordinarily wealthy due to the discovery of oil beneath their land. This newfound wealth transformed the Osage people's lives in ways both positive and tragic, setting the stage for the deep betrayal and violence that would unfold. Through its evocative portrayal of Osage County, the film invites the audience to witness a land filled with both natural beauty and societal corruption, a place where wealth and privilege collide with racial tension, greed, and exploitation. Osage County itself, located in northeastern Oklahoma, was once the ancestral home of the Osage Nation. The land, historically rich in natural resources, had been home to the Osage people for centuries. After forced relocations due to European-American expansion and government policies, the Osage eventually found a place of relative peace in this land. However, the discovery of oil in the early 20th century radically altered their situation, giving the Osage an unprecedented amount of wealth that would become both a blessing and a curse. The oil beneath Osage County transformed the Osage people into some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. Each head of household was granted rights to the land's mineral resources, and by the 1920s, the Osage were living in opulence that was far beyond what most Americans at the time could imagine. Large mansions, lavish lifestyles, and luxury cars became symbols of their newfound wealth. However, this prosperity quickly attracted the greed of white settlers, businessmen, and opportunists who saw the Osage as easy targets to exploit. The film captures the tension between the vast natural beauty of Osage County and the darker, more sinister forces of exploitation that lurked just beneath the surface. Scorsese and his team do an incredible job of showcasing the contrast between the wealth and opulence of the Osage people and the impoverished, often disinterested attitudes of those around them. The lush landscapes of Osage County, rolling hills, vast plains, and picturesque farms, stand in stark contrast to the crimes that were committed in secret. These rich landscapes, bathed in warm golden light in some scenes, echo the notion that the land itself is something both valuable and dangerous. The visual contrasts in the film emphasize the idea that this land, which should have been a source of pride and stability for the Osage, became the setting for exploitation and a tragedy that would change their lives forever. One of the most striking aspects of the setting is how it reflects the disconnection between the Osage people and the white settlers who have come to take advantage of them. While the Osage have lived on this land for generations, the settlers who are now arriving to stake their claim in the land's wealth are strangers, often with no respect for the Osage culture or history. The arrival of outsiders seeking to control the oil wealth creates a sharp divide between the Osage and the people who are meant to be their partners or allies. Scorsese uses the setting to show how these new settlers treat the Osage as nothing more than a means to an end, exploiting their wealth without any regard for their humanity. In many ways, the setting of Osage County becomes a character in itself, an ever-present reminder of the tension between wealth and power on one side, and racial injustice and exploitation on the other. The natural beauty of the area, juxtaposed with the tragic events that unfold, gives the film a haunting atmosphere. The visual landscape is one of both grandeur and isolation, which mirrors the experience of the Osage people who, despite their riches, find themselves isolated and at the mercy of those around them. Moreover, Osage County serves as a symbol of the larger systemic issues that affect not only the Osage people, but also the Native American experience at large. Throughout history, indigenous communities have been subjected to displacement, forced assimilation, and violent appropriation of their land and resources. Killers of the Flower Moon emphasizes how the wealth generated by the land was not a blessing for the Osage, but rather a catalyst for their suffering. The land that was once a source of pride for the Osage becomes the backdrop for a tale of exploitation, corruption, and murder. The stunning yet haunting visuals of the land highlight the contradiction at the heart of the story. The Osage people, who had been systematically oppressed and displaced, were now the wealthiest people in the country. But this wealth made them targets rather than protectors. The historical context of Osage County in the 1920s also adds depth to the film's exploration of race and power. During this time, the United States was still deeply segregated, with systemic racism being embedded in nearly every aspect of society, from legal systems to economic opportunities. The Osage murders were not just a series of isolated killings, but part of a broader pattern of abuse and exploitation of Native American communities. The film takes great care to show how the legal system, law enforcement, and even the federal government failed to protect the Osage people, allowing the perpetrators to act with impunity. The power dynamics at play, where the wealthy and influential white settlers could operate above the law, are made all the more apparent through the setting, which shows how the Osage were vulnerable, not just because of their wealth, but because of their status as Native Americans in a society that valued them as less than human. Scorsese's depiction of Osage County is also a commentary on the broader impact of colonialism. The Osage people's land had been taken from them through treaties. And now, in the 1920s, the Osage were again at risk of having their wealth and lives stolen, this time through manipulation, deceit, and murder. This cycle of exploitation is something that has affected Native communities for centuries, and Scorsese uses the setting to demonstrate how the Osage murders were not an anomaly, but rather part of a larger pattern of colonial violence and exploitation that continues to reverberate today. The specific location of Osage County in Oklahoma, along with the depiction of its communities and the Osage Nation's inner workings, allows the audience to connect with the historical reality of what happened in the 1920s. The setting becomes more than just a place, it becomes the emotional and thematic foundation of the film, a space where exploitation, greed, and the fight for justice collide. In many ways, Osage County is a microcosm of the broader American experience for Native Americans, where the promise of prosperity is too often overshadowed by the history of betrayal, violence, and injustice. The rural setting of Osage County also highlights the isolation of the Osage people, who, despite their wealth, find themselves alienated from the broader world. This isolation is a key theme throughout Killers of the Flower Moon, as the Osage are increasingly cut off from the outside world, both physically and emotionally. They are surrounded by people who see them as nothing more than an obstacle to their own wealth and power. This isolation is both a source of tragedy and a catalyst for the eventual awakening of the FBI, which begins to investigate the murders. The film's slow burn structure, mirrored by the rural setting, builds up to a crescendo of emotional and narrative revelations that drive home the harsh realities of the time. The Osage people's story in Killers of the Flower Moon is intrinsically tied to the discovery of oil beneath their land in the early 20th century, a discovery that transformed their lives in ways that were both breathtaking and horrifying. Before oil was discovered, the Osage were a marginalized, displaced people who had been relocated to what seemed like a barren, isolated patch of land in Osage County, Oklahoma, by the U.S. government. However, the fortune buried beneath this land would change the Osage Nation forever. By the 1920s, the Osage were among the wealthiest people in the world, thanks to the newfound oil wealth. This sudden affluence, however, set the stage for unimaginable betrayal and systemic exploitation. The film does an exceptional job of portraying the depth of the Osage people's wealth, the resentment it sparked in white settlers, and the way it led to a campaign of murder, greed, and manipulation. The film opens with the portrayal of the Osage people's prosperity. For a period, the Osage Nation experienced extraordinary wealth, with families receiving large sums of money from oil royalties. This wealth allowed the Osage to live in unprecedented luxury compared to many of their contemporaries. Mansions were built, luxury automobiles were purchased, and life for many Osage families seemed like a dream. The community members had long been denied control over their lives due to their previous forced relocations and a history of systematic oppression, and now they were finally able to enjoy some degree of economic power. The sense of triumph felt by the Osage, having reclaimed their rightful place in the world through their oil riches, was palpable. However, this wealth would also expose them to new forms of exploitation. The Osage people, despite being incredibly rich, were still subjected to a racist and oppressive system that treated them as lesser individuals. The government's bureaucratic system of guardianship over their finances, designed to protect them from financial mismanagement, ultimately worked in the opposite direction, becoming a tool for white settlers to gain control of their money. The Osage people were assigned white guardians who were legally responsible for managing their finances, guardians who often had little regard for the well-being of their wards. The system ensured that the Osage were kept at a distance from their own wealth, unable to directly manage or access their fortune without the approval of their guardians. This unique and troubling relationship between the Osage people and the outside world forms a key element of the film. It's here that the narrative starts to unfold the darker aspects of the Osage wealth. As the Osage thrived, they became the targets of those who sought to take their riches. Opportunists, businessmen, and corrupt local officials sought to capitalize on their oil wealth. The most chilling manifestation of this exploitation was the systematic murder of the Osage people. Though their land held immense wealth, the legal system that should have protected them instead facilitated their exploitation. In Killers of the Flower Moon, we see how the system, from local authorities to the federal government, remained largely indifferent or complicit in the exploitation and eventual murder of the Osage. The exploitation extended far beyond financial manipulation. It took the form of physical violence, deceit, and murder. The Osage people were hunted, literally and figuratively, by those who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to their wealth. As the murders began to unfold, many of the victims were Osage individuals who had control over oil leases or royalties, or who were connected to the powerful families benefiting from the wealth. The pattern of deaths soon became clear. Wealthy Osage individuals, especially those with direct access to the oil money, were disappearing, often under mysterious and violent circumstances. What began as the tragic deaths of a few isolated individuals grew into a larger conspiracy. Entire families were wiped out, their deaths often disguised as accidents or illnesses. The murderers' motives were clear: greed. The Osage wealth had become a coveted commodity, and the people who controlled it had to be eliminated. These killers knew that they could gain access to the wealth by marrying into Osage families, or by managing the estates of Osage individuals who had no family left to defend them. The film shows how the murders were not isolated acts of violence, but part of a larger, coordinated effort to seize control of Osage fortunes, and how the perpetrators, many of them local businessmen, some with close ties to law enforcement, used manipulation and violence to accomplish their goals. The Osage people's plight becomes even more tragic when you consider the legal landscape in which these crimes occurred. At this time, the justice system was not equipped or willing to protect the Osage people. Local law enforcement was either corrupt or apathetic, and the federal government had little interest in investigating the deaths. The Osage were treated with suspicion, their wealth seen as undeserved by many whites who felt entitled to the money. This systemic failure of justice created an environment where these murders could be carried out without fear of reprisal, and it took the concerted efforts of the newly formed FBI to uncover the truth behind the Osage killings. The way the Osage people were portrayed in the film, first as wealthy but vulnerable, and later as victims of a brutal conspiracy, shows how their wealth was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, the Osage had a kind of economic power that allowed them to live lives of luxury and independence. On the other hand, their wealth made them prime targets for the kind of predatory actions that would lead to their undoing. It's a heartbreaking irony. A group that had been wronged and displaced by centuries of American expansion was finally given a taste of prosperity, only to have that very prosperity used against them. At the heart of the film is the exploration of the human cost of this wealth. The Osage murders were not just crimes of opportunity, they were crimes fueled by deep-seated racism and a complete disregard for the humanity of the Osage people. Throughout Killers of the Flower Moon, the wealth of the Osage serves as a tragic symbol of how power and greed can corrupt, and how those in positions of privilege will stop at nothing to maintain control. The film's emotional weight lies in its portrayal of the Osage individuals, both as a collective group and as individuals whose lives were lost to this violent and systematic campaign. The Osage people are not merely seen as victims of a crime, but as individuals with their own stories, hopes, and dreams. Through the character of Molly Kyle, played by Lily Gladstone, the film highlights the human toll of the Osage murders. Her story reflects the deep pain of a people whose lives were shattered by forces they could neither predict nor prevent. Ernest Burkhart, portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio, is one of the central characters in Killers of the Flower Moon. His introduction marks a crucial turning point in the story, as his character becomes both a key player in the Osage murders and a focal point for exploring themes of loyalty, morality, and betrayal. Ernest is the nephew of William Hale, Robert De Niro, a manipulative and powerful figure who masterminds the conspiracy to murder Osage people in order to seize their wealth. At first glance, Ernest seems to be a simple man, perhaps one who is caught between the forces of his family and his emerging love for an Osage woman, Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone. But as the narrative unfolds, Ernest's role in the tragic events becomes more complex, and his internal struggle is laid bare, making him a tragic character in his own right. Ernest's arrival in Osage County is framed by his marriage to Molly, an Osage woman whose family is deeply entrenched in the oil wealth that has become both a blessing and a curse. Ernest is introduced as someone who appears to be innocent, perhaps even somewhat naive. His love for Molly seems genuine, and for a time, he is depicted as a man torn between loyalty to his uncle, who is clearly involved in the conspiracy to control Osage wealth, and his growing affection for his wife and her family. DiCaprio's portrayal of Ernest is nuanced, capturing a man who is both sympathetic and deeply flawed. At times, Ernest seems like a victim of his circumstances, someone who is caught in a web of deceit and violence far beyond his control. However, As the story unfolds, the audience comes to understand that Ernest is not merely a passive observer, but an active participant in the crimes that tear apart Molly's family. What makes Ernest such a compelling character is his moral ambiguity. On the one hand, he is shown to be genuinely in love with Molly. Their relationship begins with tenderness, and for a time, it seems as though Ernest's feelings for her might redeem him in the eyes of the audience. He is presented as a man who has the potential to rise above his family's criminal activity, yet he is also deeply entangled in it. The film carefully explores Ernest's internal conflict, his desire to do right by Molly and her family while being loyal to his uncle and caught up in the lure of wealth and power. This tension between love and loyalty is central to Ernest's character arc, and DiCaprio does an excellent job of portraying a man torn between these two opposing forces. As the story progresses, Ernest's moral dilemma becomes more pronounced. He's complicit in the murders of the Osage people, even though he is clearly struggling with the enormity of the crimes he is helping to commit. Ernest's participation in the killings, especially his role in the murder of his own wife's family, reveals the deep moral corruption that has taken root in both his character and in the larger society that enables such violence. His gradual transformation from a well-meaning, conflicted man to a more self-serving participant in the murders is depicted with heartbreaking clarity. Ernest's participation in the conspiracy is not a simple matter of greed or malice. Rather, it is a complex mixture of familial duty, fear, and the overwhelming power of his uncle's influence. Ernest's relationship with his uncle, William Hale, is one of the key drivers of his character development. Hale is a manipulative and controlling figure, and his influence over Ernest is both subtle and overwhelming. Ernest's loyalty to his uncle is clear from the beginning of the film, and as the plot unfolds, it becomes evident that Hale has groomed him to be a willing accomplice in the criminal enterprise. While Ernest may not fully understand the extent of Hale's evil machinations, he is certainly aware of the illegal and morally reprehensible actions that are being taken to secure the Osage wealth. Despite his reservations, Ernest chooses to follow Hale's lead, drawn by both familial ties and the promise of power. Hale, with his charm and authority, presents Ernest with a compelling justification for his actions, and Ernest's moral compass begins to erode as he becomes more deeply involved in the conspiracy. The film makes it clear that Ernest's participation in the murders is not merely a matter of opportunism. It is also a result of his own psychological and emotional manipulation. Hale's influence over Ernest is one of the key elements that drives his descent into complicity. As the murders unfold, Ernest's initial hesitance fades, replaced by a growing acceptance of his role in the scheme. The idea of loyalty to family becomes so deeply ingrained in him that it overshadows any sense of moral obligation he may have had toward Molly and her family. This moral corrosion is gradual, yet devastating, and Ernest's internal conflict adds a layer of tragedy to the unfolding events. While Ernest may be morally conflicted, his actions are ultimately driven by self-interest, and his character arc underscores one of the key themes of Killers of the Flower Moon: the corrupting influence of greed. The Osage murders are not just about the theft of wealth. They are about the destruction of lives, families, and communities. Ernest, caught in a web of familial loyalty and personal ambition, becomes complicit in the systematic elimination of Osage people for financial gain. His involvement in the conspiracy is not a matter of blind obedience. Rather, it is the result of a complex set of emotional and social pressures that force him into moral compromise. The eventual unraveling of Ernest's character is one of the film's most poignant moments. His realization of the depth of the crimes he has committed, and the ultimate betrayal of Molly, is a tragic and heart-wrenching moment. Ernest's inability to fully redeem himself or to make amends for the pain he has caused emphasizes the moral cost of his actions. While he may have started as a man who is conflicted, by the end of the film, he is revealed to be a man who is irrevocably marked by the violence and betrayal he has participated in. Ernest's ultimate fate is a reflection of the broader moral reckoning that the film presents. His involvement in the Osage murders, while driven by a mix of personal loyalty and self-preservation, highlights the dangers of unchecked greed and the lengths to which people will go when they are motivated by power, money, and family loyalty. DiCaprio's portrayal of Ernest is both tragic and empathetic, capturing the internal conflict of a man who starts with a sense of love and loyalty, but ultimately succumbs to the dark forces around him. William Hale, portrayed by Robert De Niro, is the pivotal antagonist in Killers of the Flower Moon, serving as the dark force driving the conspiracy that results in the brutal murders of the Osage people. As the patriarch of a powerful family in Osage County, Hale embodies the cunning and manipulative qualities of a man who has learned to exploit both his position and the people around him. His role in the story is essential not only to the plot's development, but also to the film's exploration of systemic corruption, racial inequality, and the depths of human greed. Through Hale's character, Scorsese paints a chilling portrait of how power, when unchecked and driven by greed, can lead to horrifying consequences. Hale is introduced as a well-respected and influential figure in Osage County, a man who appears to be both generous and benevolent toward the Osage people. His outward persona is one of a helpful benefactor, a man who, while immensely wealthy, still treats the Osage with a measure of kindness. This initial portrayal of Hale is important because it allows the audience to see how he uses charm, manipulative tactics, and false kindness to gain the trust of those around him. At first, Hale appears to be the opposite of the ruthless businessmen who seek to exploit the Osage. Instead, he plays the role of the good guy who is supposedly looking out for the interests of the Osage people. However, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that this facade is merely a mask to conceal his true intentions. Hale's role as the mastermind behind the Osage murders is both chilling and calculated. The wealth of the Osage people, particularly their control over oil leases, is the driving force behind Hale's insidious plot. While the Osage may be living in luxury, they are also vulnerable due to the legal system that controls their finances. The government has established a system of guardianship over the Osage, with white guardians managing their wealth. This system was supposed to protect the Osage from exploitation, but in practice, it was ripe for corruption. Hale, recognizing the opportunity, sets into motion a series of murders designed to rid the Osage of those who control the oil leases and their wealth, eventually seizing it for himself and his accomplices. What makes Hale particularly terrifying as a character is his manipulation of the people around him, especially his nephew, Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio. Hale's relationship with Ernest is one of both familial loyalty and psychological manipulation. While Ernest is initially portrayed as a man who is genuinely conflicted about his involvement in the murders, Hale's influence over him is profound. He uses Ernest's sense of family loyalty to draw him into the plot, framing the killings as necessary actions to protect their family's future. Hale positions himself as a father figure to Ernest, and his emotional manipulation is so subtle that Ernest is drawn into the conspiracy almost without realizing the full extent of the crimes they are committing. Hale's ability to mask his true intentions behind the guise of familial love and duty demonstrates the chilling power of manipulation and control. Hale's calm, methodical approach to the murders further emphasizes his villainy. Unlike the more impulsive or frantic criminals who might act out of desperation or immediate gain, Hale's actions are calculated and deliberate. He views the murders as business transactions, a necessary means to an end. For Hale, the Osage murders are not about personal animosity or hatred, but about power, control, and the accumulation of wealth. He coldly orchestrates the deaths of several Osage people, including members of Ernest's own wife's family, with the singular goal of gaining access to their oil fortunes. His ability to detach himself emotionally from the brutality of these crimes is what sets him apart as a true sociopath. He sees human lives not as valuable individuals, but as obstacles to his own financial and social advancement. Throughout the film, Hale's actions are framed against the backdrop of the systemic racism and inequality that defined the early 20th century in America. While Hale is not alone in his greed, he stands out for his ability to manipulate both the legal system and the people around him to achieve his goals. His exploitation of the Osage people is not just an isolated act of violence. It is part of a broader pattern of racist policies and practices that have historically kept Native Americans marginalized and powerless. Hale's actions are symptomatic of the larger societal forces that allowed for the systematic killing and exploitation of Native peoples, and Killers of the Flower Moon does not shy away from showing how Hale, like many others, benefited from these inequities. One of the film's most important themes is the complicity of society in enabling such violence. While Hale is undoubtedly the mastermind behind the murders, he could not have succeeded without the support of law enforcement, local officials, and even the legal system, which often turned a blind eye to the suffering of the Osage. Hale's ability to manipulate these systems, bending them to his will, is what ultimately allows him to carry out his plan. The film makes it clear that the Osage murders were not just the work of a few bad men, but part of a larger, systemic problem that allowed the rich and powerful to exploit those who were marginalized by society. In addition to his manipulative behavior, Hale is also portrayed as a deeply self-serving individual who will stop at nothing to maintain his control over the Osage wealth. He is shown to have no regard for the lives of the Osage people, nor for the emotional pain he causes to his own family. His willingness to sacrifice those closest to him for personal gain is particularly evident in the way he treats Ernest's wife, Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone. Molly, who has suffered immense loss at the hands of Hale's actions, represents the emotional cost of Hale's greed. Despite his outward appearance of concern for her, Hale sees Molly and her family as nothing more than obstacles in his path to wealth, demonstrating his cold, calculating nature. Hale's eventual downfall is both inevitable and tragic. Despite his best efforts to cover his tracks and manipulate those around him, the truth begins to unravel. His careful orchestration of the murders, his emotional manipulation of Ernest, and his reliance on the corruption of local authorities ultimately proved to be his undoing. As the investigation into the Osage murders intensifies, Hale's role in the conspiracy is exposed, leading to his eventual arrest. The film ends with a powerful message about the cost of unchecked greed and the consequences of exploiting vulnerable communities. What makes Hale such a compelling character is his dual nature. On one hand, he is a charming and manipulative figure who is able to deceive those around him with his charisma and false sense of benevolence. On the other hand, he is a ruthless killer whose thirst for power and wealth knows no bounds. Robert De Niro's portrayal of Hale captures both the outward civility and the inner darkness of the character, making him one of the most chilling figures in the film. Hale's character embodies the dangerous combination of charm, intelligence, and moral indifference that allows individuals to commit heinous acts while maintaining a facade of respectability. The chilling onset of the Osage murders marks the turning point in Killers of the Flower Moon, transitioning from the relative comfort of the Osage people's newfound wealth to the harrowing violence and terror that would engulf them. The murders, which begin as isolated incidents and slowly build in frequency and intensity, are the film's primary narrative thrust. The crimes were not mere acts of random violence, but part of a larger systemic conspiracy orchestrated by those who saw the Osage wealth as something to be taken at any cost. In this section, the film shifts from exploring the Osage people's wealth to showing the human cost of that wealth, as the community begins to face the brutality of a conspiracy designed to strip them of everything they hold dear. The murders themselves are shocking not just for their cruelty, but for the way in which the perpetrators thought so little of the lives they were taking. At the heart of the murders is the Osage wealth, the oil beneath their land, which made them some of the richest people in the world in the 1920s. This newfound prosperity, which should have been a source of empowerment for the Osage, instead made them prime targets for exploitation. White settlers and businessmen saw the Osage people not as equals or partners, but as obstacles in the way of the wealth they desired. The legal system, which was supposed to protect the Osage, was instead a tool for those who wished to control their wealth. This combination of legal and economic manipulation created a fertile ground for the murders, which would be carried out under the guise of natural causes, accidents, and unexplained deaths. As the murders begin to unfold, the first deaths are seen as strange, but not immediately suspicious. At first, the Osage people who are killed appear to have died of natural causes, accidents, or mysterious illnesses. The community is shaken by the loss, but it doesn't yet understand the extent of the conspiracy. The Osage are used to death. Many of them had experienced hardship and tragedy throughout their history, but these deaths feel different. As more and more prominent members of the Osage community die under unusual circumstances, suspicion begins to grow. The film shows how this slow realization of a larger plot is mirrored in the growing unease that spreads throughout the Osage Nation. The victims of the murders are not random. They are Osage individuals who have control over the oil wealth and oil rights. The killers, in their greed, target those who are most connected to the wealth, seeing them as a means to access the oil money. As each death occurs, the community becomes more suspicious, but the lack of any clear evidence makes it difficult to pinpoint the cause of the deaths. This initial period of uncertainty is crucial to understanding the larger conspiracy, as it illustrates how the murderers are able to operate with near impunity, hiding behind the veil of natural causes and society's indifference toward the Osage people. The first major murder in the film is the death of Anna Brown, an Osage woman and relative of Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone. Anna's death is portrayed as the first break in the otherwise quiet community, setting in motion a chain of events that will uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. Anna's death seems suspicious from the outset, but the authorities, including local law enforcement, dismiss it as a possible accident or a health issue. The film's portrayal of Anna's death shows how easily the lives of the Osage were disregarded and how deeply rooted the systemic racism was in the way these cases were handled. Anna's death is not only a personal tragedy for her family, but a catalyst for the slow unraveling of the conspiracy that would eventually come to light. As more murders occur, the pattern becomes clearer, and the film builds a mounting sense of dread. The Osage people begin to realize that they are not just victims of isolated crimes, but that they are being systematically targeted. The killers, acting on behalf of wealthy outsiders, have a clear goal: to eliminate the Osage individuals who control the oil wealth, and take that wealth for themselves. The film's structure creates a sense of tension as the investigation into these deaths slowly gathers steam, revealing the scope of the conspiracy. However, the investigation is not easy. Local law enforcement is either complicit in the murders or uninterested in investigating the deaths of Native Americans, and the FBI, under the leadership of Tom White, Jesse Plemons, is still in its infancy. One of the most disturbing aspects of the murders is the way in which the killers exploit the Osage people's trust. The conspirators, in many cases, marry into Osage families or gain access to them through legal guardianships, ensuring that the victims are isolated and unable to protect themselves. The marriage of Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, to Molly Kyle, for example, places him directly within the reach of the Osage wealth, even though his true motivations remain hidden for much of the film. This relationship is emblematic of the larger scheme at play. While the perpetrators pose as benefactors, they are, in fact, systematically stripping the Osage of their resources and their lives. Ernest's participation in these murders is particularly tragic, as his love for Molly is torn between family loyalty and his complicity in the larger conspiracy. In addition to the murders of individuals, the Osage experience a form of collective trauma. The systematic nature of the killings, which extend across several families and multiple generations, is a direct assault on the Osage people's sense of safety, identity, and culture. The Osage Nation, once a symbol of prosperity and hope, becomes a place of fear and despair. The community that once lived in relative comfort is now embroiled in a terrifying fight for survival, not just against the murderers, but against a corrupt legal system and an indifferent society. The film does not shy away from showing the emotional toll of these murders, particularly on Molly, who watches in horror as her family is torn apart by the same people she trusted. The personal loss she experiences is compounded by the realization that her own husband, Ernest, is involved in the conspiracy. As the investigation into the murders slowly progresses, the audience is drawn into the complexity of the situation. It becomes clear that the Osage people are not just victims of random acts of violence, they are the targets of a well-orchestrated plan to seize their wealth. The murders, which begin as isolated tragedies, are revealed to be part of a larger conspiracy that involves local businessmen, law enforcement, and even members of the federal government. This realization deepens the tragedy of the story, as it shows how the Osage people, despite their wealth, are powerless in the face of a system that is designed to exploit and oppress them. The escalation of the murders serves as the film's central conflict, as the Osage people struggle to survive in a world where their wealth has made them targets and their justice system has failed them. The film's careful buildup of tension, as the murders increase and the truth is slowly uncovered, creates a compelling narrative that highlights the horrific nature of the Osage murders, while also exploring the broader themes of greed, racism, and the abuse of power. Molly Kyle, played with heartbreaking grace by Lily Gladstone, stands as one of the emotional cores of Killers of the Flower Moon. Her character is not just a victim in the tragic saga of the Osage murders, but a symbol of endurance, love, and the devastating cost of betrayal. Through Molly's journey, the film explores the personal toll of the Osage murders and the heart-wrenching realization that her own family, her own husband, Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, is complicit in the plot to murder her loved ones and steal their wealth. Molly's struggle is both internal and external, as she grapples with her loyalty to her husband, her deepening understanding of the betrayal, and the overwhelming grief that accompanies the loss of her family. Molly's story begins with her place in the Osage community, where she is part of a wealthy family. But, unlike the other Osage women, she doesn't initially have the same awareness of the dangerous forces closing in on her. As a member of one of the richest communities in America at the time, Molly seems to live a life of comfort, surrounded by the opulence that comes with the wealth generated from oil beneath the Osage land. However, beneath this surface of wealth and prosperity lies the looming shadow of exploitation and violence. Molly is portrayed not just as a woman of means, but as a loving daughter, sister, and eventually wife to Ernest. She is initially oblivious to the full extent of the danger that surrounds her, trusting her husband and family, only to be slowly drawn into the devastating realization that her loved ones are the very ones plotting against her. Molly's love for Ernest is deep and sincere. From the outset of their relationship, she sees in him a partner and protector, someone who is both kind and devoted. Ernest's initial charm and love for her seem genuine, and she marries him with the hope of building a life together, one that promises stability and happiness. However, as the murders begin to unfold within her family, Molly's world begins to shatter. The people she loves most are being killed in cold blood, and the causes of their deaths seem to be connected. This rising fear is compounded by her growing suspicion that her own husband is involved in these murders. This realization is gradual, but once Molly begins to uncover the truth, the weight of it is unbearable. The pain of knowing that the man she loves, whom she trusted completely, is a part of the betrayal that has led to the loss of her family, is an emotional devastation that the film explores with profound empathy. The personal toll of Molly's heartbreak is not just in the deaths of her family members, but in the gradual erosion of the relationship she has with Ernest. She begins to notice the strange actions and behaviors of her husband, his attempts to distance himself from the events surrounding the deaths and his evasions when she asks questions. What is heartbreaking is that, even as Molly starts to suspect that Ernest may be involved, she does not want to believe it. She loves him deeply, and this emotional conflict, the struggle between loyalty to her husband and her need to protect her family, is palpable in every scene that involves them. She is torn between her affection for Ernest and the mounting evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy. This inner conflict makes her journey one of immense emotional complexity, as she is forced to face the painful reality that her trust in Ernest has been deeply betrayed. The murders that Molly witnesses are not isolated incidents, they happen within her own family, each death a blow that cuts deeper than the last. Her sister, mother, and other relatives are taken from her, Each death a reminder that the forces around her have been closing in on her family for far longer than she has known. The personal grief she experiences is compounded by the realization that this violence is not just the work of strangers, but the result of calculated manipulation by those closest to her. The film shows how each death, while traumatic on its own, is part of a larger tragedy. The Osage people, whose wealth had once brought them so much promise, are now being systematically murdered to fulfill the desires of outsiders who want to seize that wealth. As the investigation into the murders begins to gain momentum, Molly's heartbreak grows even more pronounced. She is forced to confront not only the loss of her family, but the painful truth that her own husband is implicated in these murders. Molly's pain is compounded by the realization that, even though she was targeted, even though she has suffered more than most, she cannot escape the toxic web of betrayal and greed that has ensnared her life. The film portrays her grief as multifaceted. It is the grief of losing loved ones, but it is also the grief of realizing that her trust in the man she loved and married was misplaced. Her heartbreak is not just emotional, but a profound loss of the future she had imagined with Ernest. One of the most painful aspects of Molly's story is her realization that her suffering is not just the result of personal loss, but part of a much larger scheme designed to exploit her entire community. The murders of the Osage people are not random acts of violence. They are a calculated, systematic effort to steal their wealth, and Molly is caught in the middle of it. As she begins to understand the full scope of the conspiracy, she is confronted with the painful truth that the power structures around her, the local authorities, the legal system, and even those who were supposed to protect her, have all failed her. Molly's realization that she has been failed by the very systems that were supposed to serve her is one of the most devastating elements of the film. Despite the overwhelming grief and betrayal, Molly's strength as a character is undeniable. She endures unspeakable loss, but her resilience shines through. Even as she learns the depths of the conspiracy and uncovers the painful truths about her husband's involvement, Molly refuses to be crushed by it. Her determination to survive, to continue living in the face of such profound loss, makes her one of the most compelling characters in the film. Molly's strength is not in her ability to fight back physically or to take direct action against those who have wronged her. Rather, her strength lies in her emotional endurance. She holds on to her dignity and her sense of self, even when it feels like everything around her is falling apart. In the final stages of the film, Molly's heartbreak reaches its peak as she faces the full realization of what has happened to her family. The emotional weight of this moment is devastating, as she comes to terms with the fact that she has lost not only her family but her faith in the people around her. However, even in the face of such loss, Molly's resilience remains. Her story is not one of simple victimhood, but one of survival, of finding a way to endure even when faced with the most unimaginable pain. As the brutal and systematic murders of the Osage people continue to unfold, the film shifts its focus from the growing horror faced by the Osage families to the investigation that will ultimately expose the full scale of the conspiracy. The FBI's involvement in the case is a pivotal turning point in Killers of the Flower Moon, as it marks the beginning of a formal attempt to seek justice for the Osage people. Led by Tom White, Jesse Plemons, the investigation slowly gains traction, revealing not only the depth of corruption and manipulation within the local community, but also the widespread apathy and indifference of a justice system that had largely ignored the plight of Native Americans. The FBI's investigation, despite the obstacles it faces, represents a beacon of hope for the Osage and a turning point in their struggle for justice. The Osage murders are not only horrific because of their brutality, but also because they were carried out with such calculated precision. The victims were often chosen based on their position within the Osage Nation, particularly those with direct access to the oil wealth. But for the longest time, the authorities failed to investigate the deaths seriously, brushing them aside as isolated incidents or accidents. The local law enforcement, deeply embedded in a system of corruption and racism, did little to pursue any meaningful investigation into the deaths. This failure to act was compounded by the racist attitudes of many in the community, who viewed the Osage people not as victims, but as undeserving of protection or attention. The Osage were considered second-class citizens by many in the surrounding white communities, and this institutional racism meant that their deaths were not treated with the urgency or seriousness they deserved. The arrival of the FBI in Osage County is portrayed as both a symbol of hope and an acknowledgement of the larger systemic forces at play. The newly formed FBI, under the leadership of Tom White, is a relatively young agency at the time, and their involvement in the Osage murders marks the first significant federal effort to investigate the deaths. White's character is introduced as a man with a deep sense of duty and a commitment to justice. His role in the investigation brings a sense of order and legitimacy to the otherwise chaotic and corrupt landscape of Osage County. White, despite being part of a system that had failed the Osage people in the past, represents the possibility of redemption and the potential for justice to be served. The FBI's investigation is slow and methodical, as White and his team begin to piece together the various deaths and their connections to one another. The first major obstacle the FBI faces is the overwhelming amount of resistance from the local community, which is both complicit in the conspiracy and largely uninterested in investigating the murders of Native Americans. The pervasive corruption within the local law enforcement system makes it difficult for White to get the information he needs. In fact, many of the local officials are in league with the perpetrators, and they go out of their way to obstruct the investigation. This corruption is one of the key themes of the film, highlighting the extent to which the Osage people were denied justice by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. For White and his team, uncovering the truth is not just about solving the murders, but also about navigating the complex web of corruption that keeps the perpetrators safe. As the investigation progresses, the film focuses on the small but significant breakthroughs that begin to unravel the conspiracy. The early stages of the investigation are characterized by frustration and confusion, as White's team struggles to understand the full scope of the plot. They realize that the murders are not random, rather, they are part of a systematic effort to eliminate those who control the Osage wealth. The killers, often working in tandem with corrupt businessmen, law enforcement officials, and local leaders, are able to cover their tracks and manipulate the legal system. However, White's persistence and methodical approach slowly begin to reveal the connections between the deaths and the larger conspiracy that links them all. One of the most compelling aspects of the FBI's investigation is the tension between the personal and the professional. For White and his team, the investigation is not just a job, it is a moral imperative. They are not simply solving a crime. They are fighting against a deeply entrenched system of corruption and racism that has allowed the Osage murders to persist. White's own sense of justice drives him to uncover the truth, even as he faces increasing resistance from those who want to protect the status quo. This sense of duty and moral conviction contrasts with the indifference and self-interest of the local officials, who view the Osage as expendable and unworthy of protection. Throughout the investigation, the film focuses on the way in which the FBI begins to piece together the larger conspiracy, often following seemingly small clues that eventually lead to the key figures behind the murders. One of the key moments in the investigation occurs when White and his team begin to connect the dots between the various individuals involved in the plot. They discover that the murders are not random acts of violence, but part of a coordinated effort to seize control of the Osage wealth. This realization marks a turning point in the investigation, as it becomes clear that the conspiracy reaches to the highest levels of Osage County society, implicating not just local criminals but businessmen and law enforcement officials as well. The FBI's investigation also sheds light on the deeply personal toll the murders have taken on the Osage families. For Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone, the widow of Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, and other members of the Osage community, the investigation is a source of hope that justice will finally be served. However, the investigation is also a painful reminder of the betrayal they have suffered. Molly's emotional journey, as she grapples with the loss of her family and her husband's involvement in the conspiracy, mirrors the larger themes of the film, which examines the human cost of systemic violence and corruption. As the FBI uncovers the truth, Molly's struggle becomes even more complicated, as she is forced to confront not just the loss of her loved ones, but also the realization that the man she loved has been complicit in their deaths. The FBI's involvement in the case also underscores the historical context in which the Osage murders occurred. The 1920s were a time of significant social and political change in the United States, and the federal government's involvement in the Osage murders represents a shift in how the legal system would eventually begin to address crimes committed against Native American communities. The film suggests that while the investigation into the Osage murders may have been a turning point, it also highlights the broader challenges that Native American communities faced in their struggle for justice and equality. The FBI's efforts to uncover the conspiracy represent a small but important step toward justice, but it is clear that the system of exploitation and racism that allowed the murders to happen remained largely unchallenged. The investigation into the Osage murders, as depicted in Killers of the Flower Moon, highlights the methods employed by the fledgling FBI and its ability to navigate the deeply corrupt, racially charged environment of 1920s Oklahoma. Led by the determined Tom White, played by Jesse Plemons, the FBI's role in uncovering the conspiracy that targeted the Osage people is central to the story, offering a sense of hope and justice in a world where those in power had long neglected the suffering of the Native American community. White's methods and the Bureau's involvement reflect not only the investigatory techniques of the time, but also the challenge of confronting widespread systemic corruption that had been entrenched for decades. From the outset, White's investigation is marked by its methodical and patient approach. Unlike the chaotic and often reckless pursuit of justice by local law enforcement, which had turned a blind eye to the Osage murders, the FBI embodies a more structured and professional, investigative approach. Scorsese's depiction of the Bureau in the film is rooted in historical accuracy. This period marks the early days of the FBI, an agency that was still evolving and had not yet established the widespread authority and recognition it would later achieve. For White and his team, the case of the Osage murders represents not just a chance to solve a series of murders, but an opportunity to solidify the Bureau's reputation as an effective force for justice, especially in a time when law enforcement was often mired in corruption and inefficiency. White's methods are rooted in traditional investigative techniques, focusing on building a case through careful observation, meticulous evidence collection, and a dedication to uncovering the truth. Throughout the film, White is shown as calm, methodical, and relentless, qualities that are essential in an investigation where every step forward is met with opposition and resistance. His methods contrast sharply with the local authorities, whose involvement in the conspiracy or willful ignorance of it kept the murders from being properly investigated for so long. Scorsese's film emphasizes that it is not just the murders themselves that are horrifying, but the larger societal indifference to the lives of the Osage people, who were seen as expendable by both the legal system and the general public. As White and his team dig deeper into the case, they encounter multiple layers of resistance, not only from local law enforcement, but also from the broader social structures in place that allow for the continued exploitation and oppression of Native Americans. White's first challenge is understanding just how deep the corruption runs within Osage County. He discovers that the murder victims were not random. They were carefully selected, based on their ability to control the wealth derived from the oil beneath their land. The killers sought to gain control of the oil rights, and with the legal system structured to marginalize the Osage, the murders were covered up or dismissed as accidents for far too long. White's role is crucial in slowly peeling back the layers of this conspiracy, making connections between individuals involved in the plot and the larger network of corruption that allowed these crimes to thrive. One of the key investigative methods employed by White and his team is their careful attention to detail and their ability to connect disparate pieces of evidence. Scorsese presents a tense, slow-burning investigation where the slightest clue could be the key to unraveling the larger conspiracy. One example of this is the careful documentation of the Osage deaths, which initially appeared to be isolated and unconnected. As White's team begins to link the victims, it becomes evident that the deaths were part of a broader plan orchestrated by William Hale, Robert De Niro, a local businessman who had ingrained himself into the community and was using his influence to manipulate local authorities, law enforcement, and even the Osage themselves. White's methodical approach leads to the discovery of the systemic nature of the murders. His work often involves following a trail of circumstantial evidence, understanding the social and political landscape of the area, and interviewing the people involved, many of whom are too fearful to speak out due to the widespread influence of those behind the murders. This process is slow and filled with setbacks, but White's persistence ensures that he remains focused on his goal, bringing justice to the Osage people and dismantling the conspiracy that has gripped the region for so long. The FBI's involvement also brings to light the intersection of law enforcement and politics in the 1920s. At the time, the federal government had little sway in local matters, especially in rural areas where corruption was rampant. The film shows how White's investigation faces significant hurdles, including local officials who are either directly involved in the conspiracy or are unwilling to interfere with powerful local figures like Hale. In the early stages of the investigation, the federal government's power to prosecute is limited, which means White has to carefully navigate the local power dynamics while securing the necessary evidence to break the case wide open. This tension between federal authority and local corruption is a major obstacle that White must overcome, and it underscores the difficulty of achieving justice in a society where powerful individuals are able to manipulate the legal system to their advantage. Another aspect of White's investigative methods that stands out is his relationship with the Osage community. Throughout the investigation, White must earn the trust of the Osage people, many of whom are understandably distrustful of outsiders and law enforcement, given the history of abuse and mistreatment they have suffered at the hands of the legal system. White's interaction with the Osage, particularly his growing rapport with Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone, is crucial to his success. He demonstrates a degree of empathy and respect for the community that contrasts sharply with the dismissive attitudes of local law enforcement. This human connection is key, as it allows White to gain access to information that would otherwise remain hidden and builds a bridge of trust between the FBI and the Osage. Despite the challenges, White's investigation begins to gain momentum, and as he begins to connect the pieces of the puzzle, the scope of the conspiracy becomes clear. The murders were not random. They were orchestrated with the intent of seizing control of the Osage wealth. White's methodical pursuit of the truth begins to break down the wall of silence that has protected those responsible, and as more evidence surfaces, it becomes clear that the conspiracy reaches to the highest levels of Osage County society. Throughout the investigation, the film portrays the emotional and moral weight of White's role in bringing justice to the Osage people. White is not just a lawman doing his job, he is driven by a deep sense of right and wrong, and the injustice he uncovers fuels his determination. For White, the Osage murders are more than just a case. They represent the broader struggle for justice in a society built on inequality and systemic racism. His dedication to solving the case is a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice can be pursued, and it highlights the potential for institutions like the FBI to serve as forces for positive change in a corrupt system. Killers of the Flower Moon is a masterful exploration of the many layers of deception that were integral to the Osage murders, each layer revealing more about the lengths to which people would go to exploit and betray the Osage people for financial gain. From the local level of manipulation to the broader systemic forces at play, the film unfolds how a series of carefully orchestrated lies, schemes, and betrayals were constructed to not only exploit the Osage, but also to conceal the true nature of the crimes. Scorsese's treatment of this theme emphasizes how these deceptions were not merely acts of individual corruption, but part of a larger, more pervasive culture of systemic racism, greed, and exploitation. These layers of deception reveal the cruel lengths to which those in power went to ensure that the Osage, despite their immense wealth, remained vulnerable and helpless in the face of exploitation. At the heart of the deception is the manipulation of the Osage legal system, which was supposed to protect the Osage people but instead became a tool for their continued victimization. The legal system, by design, placed the Osage under the guardianship of white individuals, who were given the authority to control their wealth. This system was one of the first layers of deception, masking itself as a protective mechanism, but in practice enabling the theft of Osage oil wealth. These guardians, who were often chosen for their connection to local power structures rather than their competence or goodwill, used their position to siphon money from the Osage under false pretenses, enriching themselves while leaving the Osage with little control over their own finances. The guardianship system was a form of institutionalized theft, a legal deception that allowed for the gradual erosion of the Osage people's wealth, even as they remained legally entitled to it. This legalized manipulation of the Osage people set the stage for more direct forms of deceit. The film illustrates how powerful individuals like William Hale, Robert De Niro, a local businessman with significant sway over the Osage County community, used their influence to perpetuate the murders and maintain control of the wealth that rightfully belonged to the Osage. Hale, who initially appears as a benevolent figure, takes advantage of the community's trust in him and uses this to conceal his true intentions. By presenting himself as a friend to the Osage and a supporter of their well-being, Hale is able to gain access to their inner circles, manipulate key individuals, and maintain the loyalty of those who could facilitate his crimes. The idea of deception as a form of control runs throughout Hale's actions. He presents a friendly, trustworthy face to the Osage while orchestrating their destruction behind the scenes. The marriage between Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone, is another key example of deception. Ernest, a central figure in the murders, begins his relationship with Molly under the pretense of love and devotion. His marriage to Molly, who is an Osage woman, provides him with direct access to the wealth and power of her family. However, as the film progresses, it becomes clear that Ernest's affections are secondary to his involvement in the larger conspiracy. This personal betrayal, hidden behind the guise of marital affection, is one of the most tragic forms of deception in the film. Ernest's dual role as a loving husband and a willing accomplice to murder encapsulates the personal and moral cost of the larger conspiracy, where the need for wealth and power often trumps human relationships and decency. The physical and emotional violence that Ernest, under the influence of his uncle Hale, perpetrates against his wife and her family serves as a stark reminder of the extent to which people can deceive themselves into believing that their actions are justified. Ernest's role in the murders is particularly heartbreaking because it underscores the insidious nature of deception. It isn't just about convincing others to participate in a crime, but about deceiving oneself into believing that one's actions are excusable or even necessary. Ernest's moral decline, driven by his loyalty to his uncle and the promise of wealth, illustrates how deception can corrupt a person's sense of self and make them complicit in something unspeakable. The deception surrounding the murders is further compounded by the way the killers sought to disguise their actions. Many of the Osage deaths were initially dismissed as accidents or natural causes, which helped cover up the true nature of the crimes. The use of poisoning, shootings, and other forms of violence was often masked by false diagnoses or manipulated medical reports, making it difficult for anyone to connect the dots between the deaths. This deception extended to the very systems that were meant to protect the Osage people, as the medical community, law enforcement, and legal system all turned a blind eye to the murders, either out of complicity or ignorance. This multi-layered deception allowed the killers to operate with near impunity, confident that their actions would not be questioned or investigated seriously. The lack of immediate response from local authorities is another layer in the deception that allowed the Osage murders to continue unchecked for so long. Local law enforcement was either involved in the conspiracy or too deeply entrenched in the power structures that benefited from the exploitation of the Osage to take action. The corrupt officials were often more concerned with protecting their own interests and maintaining the status quo than they were with investigating the deaths of the Osage people. This lack of genuine law enforcement response enabled the conspiracy to grow and take hold, as there was little to no pushback against the killers. The Osage, already vulnerable due to the guardianship system and systemic racism, were left to fend for themselves in a system that was stacked against them. The eventual involvement of the FBI marks a shift in the narrative, as it represents an external force that is not part of the local corruption. The FBI's investigation begins to peel back these layers of deception, uncovering the full scale of the conspiracy and exposing the criminals involved. However, the investigation is not easy. The deeper White and his team go into the case, the more they realize just how many layers of deception there are, and how difficult it is to unmask the truth. The murderers used everything from legal manipulation to personal relationships to create a web of lies that kept the truth hidden for years. The FBI's struggle to overcome this web of deception underscores the extent to which systemic corruption and the abuse of power can hinder justice and allow crimes to persist without consequence. The final exposure of the conspiracy is both a triumph of justice and a sobering reminder of the cost of deception. As the layers are peeled back and the truth comes to light, the film emphasizes that the Osage murders were not isolated acts of violence, but part of a broader systemic pattern of racism, exploitation, and indifference. The conspiracy that led to the murders was not just about the greed of a few individuals, but was enabled by a society that saw the Osage as lesser people and treated their lives as expendable. The emotional weight of the Osage murders in Killers of the Flower Moon is felt not only by the victims and their families, but by the audience, as the film profoundly explores the psychological and emotional toll that these brutal acts of violence have on both the individuals directly affected and the broader community. The systematic murders of the Osage people were not just horrific in their physical violence, but also in the emotional destruction they caused. The toll of betrayal, grief, and the loss of family members extends far beyond the immediate trauma of the killings, affecting the survivors for the rest of their lives. Scorsese's film takes great care to show that the murders were not isolated events but part of a larger pattern of exploitation, stripping the Osage not only of their wealth but of their sense of security, identity, and trust. At the heart of the emotional weight of the murders is Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone, whose personal journey represents the deep emotional and psychological costs borne by the Osage people. Molly's family is targeted, and she loses those closest to her, her sister, her mother, and her other relatives, each death marking a devastating blow. The loss is compounded by the realization that the violence is not random but orchestrated by people she trusted, including her own husband, Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio. For Molly, the murders are not only about the physical loss of her loved ones, but also about the emotional devastation of realizing that the very people she loved and depended on were complicit in her family's destruction. This betrayal, perhaps the most painful aspect of her story, is what anchors the film's emotional resonance. Molly's emotional journey is marked by her internal conflict. As she watches her family die in increasingly violent and inexplicable ways, she begins to sense that something is deeply wrong. Her first instinct is to trust those around her, especially her husband, Ernest, who is positioned as a seemingly loving partner. But as the murders mount and the pattern of violence becomes undeniable, her emotional response shifts from confusion and grief to suspicion and heartbreak. As she begins to uncover the truth about Ernest's role in the murders, Molly's internal battle intensifies. She loves her husband but is forced to confront the unbearable reality that he is not just an innocent bystander, but an active participant in the conspiracy to murder her family. The emotional weight of this realization is overwhelming for Molly. The psychological toll of this betrayal is something the film doesn't merely gloss over. It's portrayed in a deeply human way that emphasizes the trauma of this kind of loss. Scorsese doesn't just show Molly's grief. He allows the audience to feel it alongside her, as she struggles to reconcile the love she feels for her husband with the horrific truth of his actions. For Molly, the emotional weight of the murders extends beyond the loss of her family members. It also involves the loss of her sense of trust and security. She is a victim not just of physical violence, but of a much larger betrayal, one that goes beyond her immediate family to encompass the entire Osage community. The Osage people were at the time among the wealthiest individuals in the world, but that wealth came at the expense of their safety. Molly's emotional devastation is tied to the realization that the very systems that should have protected her, law enforcement, legal guardianship, and the government, were complicit in the theft and exploitation of her family's wealth. The emotional destruction of the Osage people is not just personal, it is systemic. Molly's grief is rooted in the loss of faith in these systems, which were meant to be sources of protection but instead facilitated the crimes. This sense of betrayal is mirrored in the broader Osage community, as many families are similarly affected by the loss of loved ones and the breakdown of trust in the institutions that were supposed to help them. The film takes great care to show how the Osage community is affected by the murders on a collective level. The murders are not just the loss of individual lives, but the loss of an entire way of life. The Osage, who were once thriving, are slowly torn apart by the violence. As more and more members of the community are killed, the sense of fear and insecurity spreads throughout the Osage nation. The community, once bound by wealth and shared prosperity, becomes fragmented and isolated as the perpetrators of the murders continue their campaign of violence with impunity. The emotional weight of this collective trauma is felt throughout the film, as the Osage people realize that they are living in a world where they cannot trust their neighbors, their legal system, or even their own families. The psychological toll of this uncertainty and betrayal is profound, and it is reflected in the film's portrayal of the Osage's growing sense of vulnerability and hopelessness. The impact of the murders on the Osage people is also explored through the lens of their cultural identity. The Osage were a proud and independent people, and their sudden vulnerability in the face of such violent exploitation is an assault not only on their wealth, but on their very sense of self. For the Osage, the murders represent an attack on their culture, their history, and their place in the world. The emotional weight of this is most clearly seen in the character of Molly, whose family is the target of the conspiracy. Molly's grief is not just the loss of family members, but the loss of her identity as an Osage woman. The film poignantly explores how the Osage are forced to confront not only the violence of their immediate circumstances, but also the deeper emotional and cultural cost of the betrayals they face. The emotional toll of the murders is also reflected in the way the victims' families are left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. As the murders continue and the conspiracy slowly unravels, the Osage survivors are forced to confront not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the horror that their family members were murdered for the wealth that should have been their protection. The realization that their loved ones were killed not by strangers, but by those who were supposed to care for them, is a betrayal of the deepest kind. The survivors' grief is compounded by the knowledge that the entire system of law and order has failed them, and that justice is a distant hope rather than a reality. This creates a sense of helplessness and despair that permeates the film, particularly as the Osage struggle to find any avenue of recourse for the crimes committed against them. At the center of all this emotional turmoil is the question of justice. The emotional weight of the murders is compounded by the frustration of seeing justice denied for so long. The Osage people are victimized not only by those who killed them, but by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. The FBI's investigation into the murders is presented as a small beacon of hope, but it comes too late for many of the victims, and the emotional scars of the murders run deep. The film's exploration of this delayed justice is a sobering reminder of the systemic forces that allowed the Osage murders to go unpunished for so long. The emotional cost of these crimes, for both the victims and the survivors, cannot be undone by any investigation or legal resolution. The film ultimately serves as a reminder that some wounds are too deep to be healed by simply uncovering the truth. Killers of the Flower Moon is more than just a compelling narrative about the Osage murders. It is a profound exploration of a dark chapter in American history, one that has been largely overlooked and forgotten by the broader public. The film delves into the systemic racism exploitation, and corruption that defined the treatment of Native American communities, particularly the Osage, during the early 20th century. At its core, the movie addresses the historical significance of the Osage murders as part of a larger centuries-long pattern of injustice against indigenous peoples in America. Scorsese's film places these events in the context of broader historical and social issues, shedding light on the ways in which wealth, power, and racism intersected to allow such horrific crimes to occur, and how these crimes were ultimately swept under the rug. The murders of the Osage people were not isolated acts of violence, but part of a larger history of exploitation and disenfranchisement of Native American tribes. The Osage, despite being one of the wealthiest communities in the world due to the discovery of oil beneath their land, found themselves in the crosshairs of a system that had long viewed indigenous people as subjugated and dispossessed. The Osage murders highlight the ways in which systemic racism and power dynamics shaped the treatment of Native peoples, even when they were the beneficiaries of considerable wealth. In fact, it was precisely because the Osage had achieved financial independence and prosperity that they became targets for murder, as white settlers and businessmen sought to control their wealth. One of the most significant historical aspects of the Osage murders is the role that the U.S. government played in facilitating the Osage people's exploitation. The legal system, which was supposed to protect the Osage, instead played a key role in their victimization. The government had set up a system of guardianship for the Osage people, assigning white guardians to manage their wealth. This system was ostensibly created to protect the Osage from financial mismanagement, but in practice, it became a tool for exploitation. Many of the Osage who had been assigned guardians were systematically defrauded of their wealth, and their financial rights were stripped from them. Guardians often had full control over the oil royalties, taking advantage of their position to steal from the Osage people, either by manipulation or outright fraud. This legal mechanism served as a form of institutionalized theft and is a central theme in the film. The guardianship system allowed unscrupulous individuals, like William Hale, Robert De Niro, to manipulate the legal process to their advantage. Hale, who plays a major role in orchestrating the murders, uses his wealth and influence to further entrench himself within the Osage community, gaining the trust of local officials and even the federal government. The fact that Hale was able to exploit the Osage in such an organized manner reflects the broader historical pattern of Native American displacement and subjugation. The film underscores the systemic nature of these crimes, showing how the legal and economic systems were complicit in the exploitation of the Osage. The historical significance of the Osage murders extends beyond the immediate aftermath of the killings. The case represents the intersection of American capitalism, racism, and the dispossession of Native peoples. The Osage murders were not merely about personal greed. They were about controlling land, resources, and wealth, and maintaining a racial hierarchy that relegated Native Americans to a lower status. The fact that the murders occurred in a period of extreme racial inequality highlights the ways in which economic power was often concentrated in the hands of white Americans, while Native American communities were forced to navigate a system that continually undermined their autonomy and prosperity. The Osage murders serve as a stark reminder of the lengths to which powerful individuals would go to retain control over resources and wealth, regardless of the cost to marginalized communities. The film also serves as a lens through which the audience can view the broader history of American colonialism. The Osage were among the many indigenous groups who had been displaced, often forcibly, from their ancestral lands as part of the U.S. government's policy of westward expansion. After their relocation to Oklahoma, the Osage were told they were being given land that was undesirable. However, this undesirable land turned out to be rich in oil, which brought them newfound wealth. Ironically, the very wealth that had been promised to provide a better life for the Osage instead made them targets for exploitation. The Osage murders reveal the complexities of colonialism and the way it continues to impact indigenous communities, even when they seem to have achieved some measure of prosperity or independence. The film suggests that this is not just a history of violence and exploitation, but one of continuous efforts to reclaim, control, and profit from the land and resources that indigenous peoples were always connected to. One of the most striking elements of the film is the role that the FBI played in the investigation, which at the time was still a relatively young and developing agency. The FBI's involvement is significant because it represents the first time that a formal federal effort was made to bring justice to Native American victims. Prior to this, law enforcement at the local and state levels had been deeply complicit in or indifferent to the crimes committed against the Osage people. The involvement of the FBI not only marked a shift in law enforcement's approach to crimes against Native Americans, but it also highlighted the challenges the agency faced in investigating crimes that were tied to widespread corruption and power dynamics. The FBI's struggle to bring justice to the Osage people underscored the deep-seated institutional racism that persisted in the early 20th century, and it also highlighted the difficulty of achieving meaningful justice in a system so entrenched in its own corruption. The emotional weight of the Osage murders is also tied to their broader historical significance. For the Osage people, the murders were not just a personal tragedy, but part of a long history of being exploited, displaced, and killed for their resources. The Osage, despite their wealth, were powerless to stop the violence that was being inflicted upon them. This feeling of helplessness is compounded by the realization that the legal and social systems in place were not designed to protect them, but to enable the theft of their land and wealth. The film suggests that the Osage murders were part of a larger cultural and historical pattern of systemic violence that Native American communities have faced for centuries. Scorsese's exploration of the Osage murders serves as a reminder that the crimes committed against them were not just individual acts of violence, but were part of a broader system of colonial violence that continues to affect Native communities today. The historical significance of the Osage murders extends into the present, as the legacy of these crimes continues to reverberate through the lives of the Osage people. While the murders were eventually investigated and the perpetrators were brought to justice, the scars left on the Osage Nation have not healed. The trauma, grief, and loss experienced by the Osage people as a result of these murders is still felt by descendants of the victims, and the broader narrative of the Osage people's history continues to be one of resilience, resistance, and reclamation of their identity. The film makes it clear that the Osage murders, while horrifying, are just one chapter in a long history of injustice that continues to shape the lives of indigenous people across the United States. The climax and resolution of Killers of the Flower Moon offer both emotional catharsis and a somber reflection on the nature of justice, betrayal, and the long-lasting effects of systemic corruption. As the film builds to its devastating conclusion, the complex web of lies, manipulation, and violence that has plagued the Osage community slowly unravels. What begins as a series of mysterious deaths in Osage County evolves into a powerful investigation, revealing the scale of the conspiracy. The final moments of the film are not only a resolution to the murders themselves, but also an exploration of the consequences of such deep-rooted corruption, leaving the audience to grapple with the moral costs of the past and the challenge of finding closure. The film's narrative tension reaches its peak as the investigation into the Osage murders moves toward a confrontation with the masterminds behind the crimes. Tom White, Jesse Plemons, and the FBI team, having carefully pieced together the puzzle of the murders, begin to connect the perpetrators to the wealth they were trying to steal from the Osage people. This unraveling process is methodical, but fraught with tension. The conspiracy, which involved not just a few rogue criminals, but an entire network of people complicit in the theft and murder, begins to collapse as key pieces of evidence are uncovered. Scorsese emphasizes the slow, meticulous nature of the investigation, demonstrating the painstaking work of law enforcement in a system that actively worked to conceal the truth. One of the most intense moments in the climax is the gradual realization by the Osage people themselves, particularly Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone, of just how deep the betrayal goes. Molly, who has already endured the unimaginable loss of her family members, is confronted with the horrifying truth that the man she loved, Ernest Burkhart, is not only complicit in the deaths of her relatives, but has played a direct role in their murders. This moment, which marks the emotional crux of the film, is not just a personal betrayal, but also an indictment of the broader system that allowed such crimes to go unchallenged for so long. Molly's heartbreak is palpable as she realizes the full extent of the conspiracy, and her internal conflict between her lingering love for Ernest and her devastating grief mirrors the larger moral dilemma faced by those who have been victimized by systemic oppression. The tension culminates in a courtroom scene where William Hale, Robert De Niro, the chief orchestrator of the murders, is put on trial. Hale's role as the manipulative figurehead of the conspiracy comes into sharp focus here. Throughout the film, Hale has been portrayed as a charismatic and cunning figure who hides his true intentions behind a veneer of respectability. His wealth, influence, and charm have allowed him to manipulate not only the Osage people, but also the law enforcement and legal systems to his advantage. As the evidence mounts and the net tightens around him, the film shows the frailty of his carefully constructed facade. Hale, who had once been seen as a friend of the Osage, is now revealed as a cold-blooded murderer, willing to kill without hesitation to secure his financial dominance. His ultimate exposure as the mastermind behind the murders is a moment of bittersweet justice. While the truth is revealed, the emotional cost of the crimes and the depth of the betrayal remain. While the courtroom scenes provide a sense of resolution in terms of the legal proceedings, the emotional resolution for Molly and the Osage community is far more complicated. The legal justice of the trial is a necessary step in holding the perpetrators accountable, but it does little to undo the immense emotional damage that has been inflicted. Molly's journey from her initial trust in Ernest to her discovery of his involvement in the murders leaves her in an emotional limbo. The resolution of the case does not bring her peace, as the scars of her grief and the destruction of her family will remain with her long after the trial. Scorsese emphasizes that true healing cannot be found simply through legal justice, and that the psychological toll of such violence cannot be erased by a conviction alone. Molly's journey of loss and betrayal serves as a haunting reminder of the personal costs of systemic violence. As the final credits roll, the film's resolution is not one of triumphant justice, but of a somber reflection on the enduring effects of exploitation and the long road to accountability. The Osage murders, as horrific as they were, are a reflection of broader social and racial dynamics that have shaped American history. Scorsese uses the resolution of the film to highlight the larger narrative of colonialism, racism, and the dehumanization of Native American communities. While the legal victories of the investigation and trial are important, they cannot erase the deep wounds caused by centuries of oppression. The Osage people's wealth, which was supposed to symbolize their hard-earned prosperity, was instead the trigger for a cycle of violence that robbed them of their lives, their families, and their dignity. The film's resolution invites the audience to reflect on how such historical injustices continue to reverberate, affecting the lives of Native Americans today. Another key element of the resolution is the involvement of the FBI in the case, which serves as a symbol of institutional change and accountability. While the investigation is by no means perfect or fully sufficient in bringing about justice, the film suggests that it marks a shift in the way that crimes against Native Americans were handled. The involvement of the FBI, a new and relatively inexperienced agency at the time, represents an attempt to break free from the systemic corruption that had allowed the Osage murders to continue unchecked. The film emphasizes that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there are individuals and institutions that are willing to fight for justice, even when that fight is difficult, dangerous, and complicated. Tom White and his team may not have been able to undo the damage done to the Osage people, but their efforts were critical in exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. The resolution also highlights the personal toll of justice, not just on the victims, but on the perpetrators. The emotional and psychological impact on Ernest, who is ultimately convicted for his role in the murders, is felt in the closing moments of the film. Ernest's journey is one of gradual moral corruption, and by the end of the story, he is a broken man. His complicity in the murders is undeniable, yet the film shows how the web of deception and manipulation ensnared him as much as it did the Osage people. His eventual realization of the depth of his actions and the pain he has caused is a tragic and sobering moment, reflecting the broader themes of moral responsibility and the cost of betrayal. Ultimately, Killers of the Flower Moon closes on a note of somber reflection. The resolution of the murders and the exposure of the conspirators provide some measure of justice, but they cannot undo the profound losses experienced by the Osage community. Scorsese's focus on the long-term emotional and cultural consequences of the murders ensures that the film does not offer an easy resolution. Instead, the film challenges the audience to reflect on the broader implications of these crimes, how they were enabled by a corrupt system, and how they continue to impact the descendants of the victims. The final resolution is one of bittersweet justice, where the truth is uncovered, but the scars of the past remain. The historical significance of Killers of the Flower Moon is multifaceted, offering a sobering examination of a tragic chapter in American history that has been largely overshadowed. The Osage murders, which form the crux of the film's narrative, reveal the depths of exploitation and violence that Native American communities, particularly the Osage, faced during the early 20th century. These murders, orchestrated by individuals who sought to steal the Osage wealth, serve as a poignant reminder of the systemic racism, colonialism, and unchecked greed that fueled such heinous acts. Beyond the immediate story of the Osage murders, the film explores how this dark period in history is a reflection of the broader mistreatment of Native American peoples throughout the history of the United States. The murders of the Osage people, though horrifying in their own right, were not isolated incidents. Instead, they were symptomatic of a larger, pervasive culture of exploitation that has defined much of the American experience, especially when it comes to indigenous peoples. The Osage were among the wealthiest people in the world due to the oil deposits beneath their land, and yet they were subjected to a system that viewed them not as autonomous, sovereign people, but as targets for exploitation. Their wealth, rather than providing them with safety or security, became the very reason they were vulnerable to violence. The way in which their wealth attracted predatory individuals who sought to exploit them further underscores the way in which Native communities were often treated as obstacles to be overcome in the pursuit of American expansionism and wealth. The Osage murders, therefore, become a microcosm of the broader history of Native American dispossession and violence, a theme that resonates throughout the film. The U.S. government's role in enabling this exploitation is a crucial element of the film's historical significance. While the government ostensibly had a duty to protect the rights of Native Americans, in practice, it frequently acted to disenfranchise and exploit them. The Osage murders occurred during a period when the federal government had instituted the guardianship system for Native peoples, which was meant to protect them from being defrauded by outsiders. However, this system was itself deeply corrupt, allowing white guardians to manage the wealth of Native Americans, often for their own benefit. This guardianship system, which placed the Osage under the control of white individuals, was an institutionalized form of exploitation, and it laid the foundation for the Osage murders. The fact that the system that was supposed to safeguard the Osage instead facilitated their victimization speaks volumes about the systemic nature of the injustices they faced. The guardianship system wasn't just a tool of financial control, it was a form of cultural erasure, systematically denying the Osage control over their own affairs. The Osage, who had been forcibly relocated to Oklahoma years earlier, were already victims of American expansion and colonization. When oil was discovered on their land, it seemed like a blessing, offering the Osage a degree of prosperity and autonomy. However, the government's guardianship system essentially kept them in a perpetual state of dependence, preventing them from fully controlling their newfound wealth. This historical context is essential for understanding the gravity of the Osage murders. It was not just about a few opportunistic individuals exploiting a wealthy community. It was about a deeply entrenched system of power that systematically oppressed and disenfranchised the Osage, leaving them vulnerable to the very forces that had historically sought to exploit them. The historical significance of the Osage murders is also underscored by the involvement of law enforcement, which either failed to investigate the crimes or actively participated in covering them up. The lack of action from local authorities is a reflection of the racial dynamics of the time, where Native American lives were often seen as less valuable than those of white citizens. The complicity of local law enforcement in the murders highlights the ways in which racism was institutionalized, with the justice system turning a blind eye to crimes committed against indigenous peoples. This apathy and negligence created an environment in which the perpetrators felt emboldened to continue their crimes without fear of reprisal. The fact that the murders were allowed to go uninvestigated for so long speaks to the broader social and cultural forces at work. Forces that saw the Osage and other Native American communities as expendable. The eventual involvement of the FBI in the investigation is a key turning point in the film's historical narrative. At the time, the FBI was still a young and developing institution, and its investigation into the Osage murders was one of its first major cases. The fact that the federal government had to step in to address the systemic failures at the local level speaks to the deep-seated issues of racism and corruption within the legal system. The FBI's involvement in the case was not just about solving a series of murders. It was about challenging a corrupt system that had allowed the Osage to be systematically exploited and murdered. For the Osage, the FBI's investigation was a ray of hope in an otherwise bleak situation, offering the possibility of justice in a world where it had long been denied. However, the resolution of the case, while offering some measure of justice, also reveals the deep scars left by the murders. Even when the perpetrators are brought to trial, the emotional and psychological toll of the murders cannot be undone. The Osage people, particularly the surviving family members, are left to grapple with the aftermath of their losses. The betrayal by family members, the complicity of local authorities, and the broader cultural and systemic forces that allowed these crimes to unfold leave lasting scars on the community. The fact that justice is achieved in the legal sense does little to heal the emotional wounds caused by the murders, and this is a crucial aspect of the film's historical significance. It emphasizes that legal justice, while necessary, cannot always repair the deep emotional and cultural trauma caused by systemic violence. The broader historical context of the Osage murders is also deeply intertwined with the history of American colonialism and the continued struggle of indigenous peoples for sovereignty, recognition, and justice. The Osage, like many Native American communities, have faced a long history of displacement, violence, and exploitation at the hands of the U.S. government and settler colonial forces. The Osage murders are a particularly stark example of how indigenous peoples were often forced to navigate a system that sought to extract their wealth and resources, while denying them the power to control their own destinies. The film's portrayal of the Osage murders serves as a reminder that the history of Native American oppression is not just a thing of the past, but a living history that continues to impact indigenous communities today. Moreover, Killers of the Flower Moon highlights how indigenous struggles for justice are often erased from mainstream narratives. The Osage murders, while an important part of American history, were largely forgotten until relatively recently. The film's historical significance lies in its ability to resurrect this painful chapter of history, shedding light on the forgotten victims and giving them a voice. By centering the story of the Osage, the film forces the audience to confront the brutal legacy of racism, exploitation, and violence that continues to affect Native American communities. The conclusion of Killers of the Flower Moon not only resolves the immediate narrative of the Osage murders, but also forces the audience to confront the long-lasting effects of the crimes, both on the individual characters and the broader Osage community. While the film brings some measure of justice to the Osage people through the FBI's investigation and the eventual exposure of the murderers, it also leaves the audience with a somber reflection on the enduring consequences of systemic exploitation, racism, and betrayal. The murders of the Osage, and the way these crimes were enabled by a deeply corrupt system, represent a chapter in American history that continues to resonate today. Scorsese's film serves as a powerful reminder of the persistence of historical injustices and the long road to true reconciliation. One of the central themes of the film's conclusion is the emotional and cultural toll of the murders on the Osage community. The story of the Osage is not just one of individual loss, but of collective trauma. The murders were not isolated acts of violence. They were part of a larger systemic pattern of exploitation and dispossession that has characterized much of Native American history. The Osage, despite their wealth, were rendered vulnerable by a combination of racist legal structures, corrupt local authorities, and the greed of white settlers who sought to take what was rightfully theirs. The film does not offer a simplistic solution to this tragedy. Instead, it underscores the complexities of justice and healing for a community that has been subjected to decades of exploitation and violence. Molly Kyle's, Lily Gladstone, personal journey is emblematic of the broader emotional weight of the murders. Throughout the film, Molly is forced to reconcile her love for her husband, Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, with the horrifying realization that he has been complicit in the murders of her own family. Her grief is not just the result of personal betrayal, but a deeper cultural trauma that extends beyond her family to the entire Osage community. Her emotional devastation reflects the psychic toll of living in a society that has failed to protect her people. The sense of loss Molly experiences is compounded by the realization that the legal and social systems in place were not designed to safeguard her, but rather to exploit and oppress her people. The film highlights how the emotional wounds inflicted by such violence do not simply disappear with a conviction or a legal resolution. They linger long after the perpetrators are brought to justice. The resolution of the murders and the eventual exposure of those responsible offer a sense of catharsis, but it is tempered by the recognition that justice is never truly complete. The legal proceedings, while significant, cannot undo the harm done to the Osage families. The emotional scars left by the murders, particularly for Molly and other survivors, are too deep to be healed by a conviction alone. The film illustrates the inadequacy of legal justice when it comes to addressing the deeper cultural trauma caused by systemic exploitation and betrayal. The resolution, therefore, becomes not just a matter of solving a crime, but of grappling with the emotional and psychological aftermath of the violence. Even with the perpetrators brought to trial, the trauma endured by the Osage community remains a heavy burden that cannot be easily lifted. The film's exploration of the legacy of the Osage murders also invites the audience to reflect on the broader historical context in which these crimes occurred. The Osage murders were not an anomaly in the history of Native American suffering. They were part of a much larger pattern of violence and exploitation that indigenous peoples have endured for centuries. The American expansion into native lands, the forced relocation of tribes, and the systematic efforts to erase indigenous cultures and control their resources all contributed to the vulnerability of communities like the Osage. The film highlights how these historical injustices continue to reverberate in the lives of Native Americans today. The Osage murders, like many other instances of colonial violence, are a stark reminder of the long-lasting effects of systemic racism and colonialism on indigenous peoples. In this way, Killers of the Flower Moon is not only a historical drama about a specific set of murders, but also a larger commentary on the ongoing struggles for justice, recognition, and healing that Native American communities face. The film asks the audience to consider the enduring impact of these historical wrongs, not just in terms of legal resolutions, but in terms of the cultural, emotional, and psychological effects that persist across generations. The Osage murders are a tragic chapter in American history, but they are also a reflection of the larger patterns of violence and exploitation that have shaped the relationship between Native American communities and the broader American society. The enduring legacy of the Osage murders is also about the resilience of the Osage people. While the film focuses on the pain and suffering caused by the murders, it also highlights the strength and determination of the Osage survivors, particularly those who fought to ensure that justice was done. The film's depiction of the FBI's investigation serves as a reminder of the importance of persistence in the face of adversity. Despite the widespread corruption, resistance from local authorities, and apathy from the broader society, the Osage people, with the help of the federal government, were able to expose the conspiracy and begin the process of seeking justice. This resilience is a key part of the film's message. While the past may be filled with unimaginable pain and loss, there is also hope in the capacity for change and accountability. Moreover, the film serves as an important reminder of the need to remember and reckon with the past. The Osage murders, though a horrific chapter in American history, were not widely known or acknowledged for many years. By bringing this story to the forefront, Scorsese ensures that the Osage people's suffering is not forgotten. The film's historical significance lies not only in its portrayal of the murders themselves, but also in its ability to resurrect a long-forgotten story and force the audience to confront the darker aspects of American history that are often overlooked. The emotional weight of the film, particularly in its exploration of the grief and trauma experienced by the Osage, ensures that the audience cannot simply dismiss the past, but must engage with it in a meaningful way. Killers of the Flower Moon is a haunting and powerful historical drama that not only illuminates a dark chapter of American history, but also explores the deep emotional and cultural ramifications of systemic violence. Directed by Martin Scorsese, the film is based on the non-fiction book by David Grann, which recounts the chilling story of the Osage murders in 1920s Oklahoma. This was a period when the Osage people, who had become incredibly wealthy due to the discovery of oil beneath their land, were systematically targeted, manipulated, and murdered by outsiders seeking to steal their wealth. What makes the film truly captivating is not just the historical details, but the raw human emotion it brings to life. The film follows the lives of several key characters, most notably Molly Kyle, Lily Gladstone, an Osage woman who becomes a central figure in the conspiracy, and her husband, Ernest Burkhart, Leonardo DiCaprio, who is caught between familial loyalty and a growing realization of his role in the murders. Robert De Niro plays William Hale, a manipulative businessman and patriarch who orchestrates the murders. Each actor delivers a powerful performance that brings both the tension and heartbreak of the situation to life. Scorsese's direction is meticulous in capturing the emotional weight of the story, and the film's pacing allows for a slow but intense build-up to the shocking revelations. While the investigation, led by the fledgling FBI, brings a sense of legal resolution, the emotional and psychological consequences of the crimes linger, highlighting the ongoing trauma faced by the Osage people. The film masterfully intertwines personal betrayal with a broader critique of systemic racism and colonialism, making it not just a crime drama, but a profound social commentary. The cinematography of Killers of the Flower Moon is equally striking, with wide sweeping shots of the Oklahoma landscape that contrast beautifully with the intimate moments of grief, suspicion, and realization among the Osage characters. The soundtrack complements the film's tone, adding layers to the haunting atmosphere. Ultimately, Killers of the Flower Moon is not just a historical recounting of a series of murders, but an emotional journey into the heart of American injustice. It asks difficult questions about the price of power, the consequences of unchecked greed, and the enduring resilience of indigenous communities. It's a film that stays with you long after the credits roll, leaving you reflecting on the past and its ongoing impact on the present. Thanks for watching our review of Killers of the Flower Moon. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more movie reviews, deep dives, and discussions on the latest films. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the movie? Drop your comments below and feel free to share this video with fellow movie buffs. Stay tuned for more content, and remember to keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep watching, keep thinking, and keep feeling the power of cinema.